Did you know that when Italian soldiers first encountered American infantry units in 1943, they couldn't understand what they were seeing? They watched American squads, just 10 or 12 men, moving through Sicily with what seemed like impossible amounts of equipment. "Where are their supply wagons?" one Italian lieutenant asked, studying captured American positions through binoculars. "Where are the ammunition carriers, the pack animals? How do they carry all this?" The Italians were counting rifles, ammunition pouches, grenades, the normal infantry loadout. What they failed to count, what they couldn't even conceptualize until they experienced it firsthand, was that each American infantry squad carried more sustained firepower than an entire Italian company. Not because American soldiers were stronger or braver, but because American industrial capacity had miniaturized, mechanized, and multiplied firepower to a degree that made traditional infantry tactics obsolete. This is the story of how Italian soldiers learned the hardest way possible that they weren't fighting soldiers. They were fighting walking arsenals, and the war they'd trained for no longer existed. The story begins in July 1943 on the beaches of Sicily as Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Italy, commenced. Italian coastal defense units watched the invasion fleet approach with a mixture of dread and confidence. Dread because the fleet was enormous, hundreds of ships stretching to the horizon. Confidence because they were prepared for beach defense. They knew the terrain, and they understood infantry combat. Capitano Alessandro Russo commanded a coastal defense company. 120 men dug into positions overlooking the landing beaches south of Gela. His men were equipped according to Italian army standards: Carcano rifles, some World War I vintage, a few breeder light machine guns, temperamental weapons that required constant maintenance, some breeder 30 machine guns with small magazines that made sustained fire impossible, grenades, bayonets, and 2 small mortars with limited ammunition. By Italian standards, Russo's company was well equipped. They had defensive positions, good fields of fire, and numerical superiority over any landing force they expected to face. Russo had studied military theory. He knew that defenders on prepared ground had a 3-to-1 advantage. The Americans would have to cross open beaches under fire, then assault uphill into prepared positions. It should have been a slaughter. The landing craft doors dropped, and American soldiers poured out onto the beaches. Russo's men opened fire, rifles cracking, the breeder guns chattering in short bursts. Americans fell on the beaches, but the rest kept coming, running through the surf, taking cover behind beach obstacles. So far, everything matched Russo's expectations. Then the Americans started shooting back, and Russo realized nothing about this battle matched his expectations. The volume of fire coming from the beach was impossible. It sounded like an entire battalion was firing, but Russo could see it was just scattered squads. Small groups of men, maybe 10 or 12 per group, spread out across several hundred meters of beach, yet they were producing more sustained fire than Russo's entire company. "What are they shooting?" his sergeant yelled over the roar of gunfire. "How many machine guns do they have?" That was the question that would haunt Italian soldiers throughout the campaign. The answer was simple but revolutionary. The Americans had effectively made every infantryman a machine gunner. The standard American infantry squad in 1943 consisted of 12 men, organized around the M1 Garand rifle and the Browning automatic rifle. 8 men carried M1 Garands, semi-automatic rifles that fired as fast as you could pull the trigger, held 8 rounds in an internal magazine, and could be reloaded in 2 seconds with a stripper clip. 2 men carried bars, fully automatic rifles that fired the same .3006 ammunition as the Garand, held 20 rounds, and could put out sustained fire rivaling a light machine gun. 1 man carried an M1 carbine, and 1 was the squad leader. Compare this to Russo's Italian company. His men carried Carcano rifles, bolt-action weapons that held 5 rounds and required manual cycling between each shot. Sustained rate of fire, maybe 10 to 15 aimed shots per minute. His machine gun teams carried breeder guns that overheated quickly, jammed frequently, and had magazines holding only 20 rounds that had to be manually changed. The firepower difference was staggering. A single American squad of 12 men, each with an M1 Garand firing 8 rounds semi-automatically, could put out more sustained fire than an Italian platoon of 40 men with bolt-action rifles. Add in the 2 BARs, and the squad had firepower comparable to an Italian company. But Russo didn't understand this yet. He just knew something was very wrong. His men were firing as fast as they could work their bolt-action rifles. Aim, fire, pull bolt, eject shell, chamber new round, aim again. The Americans seemed to be firing continuously without the pause between shots. "They have automatic rifles!" one of Rousseau's men shouted. "Everyone has automatic rifles!" That wasn't quite true, but it was close enough. The M1 Garand wasn't fully automatic, but semi-automatic fire was so much faster than bolt action that it felt like facing automatic weapons. An American soldier could fire 8 aimed shots in the time it took an Italian soldier to fire 3 or 4. The Americans advanced under this wall of fire. Italian soldiers who raised their heads to shoot found themselves taking fire from multiple directions simultaneously, not because they were surrounded, but because every American soldier was putting out enough fire to seem like multiple shooters. Rousseau ordered his machine gun teams to concentrate fire on the advancing Americans. The Breda guns opened up, and for a few seconds achieved the sustained fire needed to pin down the assault. Then both guns jammed simultaneously, a common problem with the Breda design, which was notoriously unreliable in sandy conditions. While his machine gunners frantically worked to clear the jams, the American fire didn't slacken at all. The bars kept firing, pouring out 20-round bursts. The Garands kept cracking, every soldier pumping out rounds as fast as he could aim. And then Rousseau heard something that chilled him. A distinctive thump-thump-thump sound that he recognized from training films. Mortars. The Americans had brought mortars onto the beach. Italian military doctrine held that mortars were support weapons that stayed well behind the front lines. They required multiple men to carry and operate. The tube, the baseplate, the ammunition. You didn't bring mortars into an assault because they were too heavy and cumbersome. They were for static warfare, for siege operations, for prepared positions. The Americans apparently hadn't read Italian military doctrine. They'd brought 60mm mortars right up with the assault troops. These were light mortars that could be carried and operated by 2 men, firing high-explosive shells in high arcs over obstacles. Within minutes of landing, American mortar teams were dropping shells on Italian positions with disturbing accuracy. Rousseau's prepared positions, which should have been safe from direct fire, started exploding. The mortar shells came down nearly vertically, landing in trenches and foxholes that were protected from rifle fire. His men started taking casualties not from the frontal assault, but from explosives falling from the sky. "Fall back to secondary positions," Rousseau ordered. His company retreated 200 meters to their second line of defense, leaving behind a dozen dead and wounded. They'd held the beach for maybe 20 minutes, far less than expected, but Rousseau told himself they'd bloodied the Americans and could hold the next line. The Americans kept coming, and that's when Rousseau saw something that made him question everything he understood about infantry operations. The American soldiers weren't carrying just rifles and ammunition. They were walking armories. Each man had a basic load that would have required a pack animal in the Italian army. Web belts with ammunition pouches holding 80 rounds for Garands and more for bars. Grenades. Not just 1 or 2, but 4, 6, 8 grenades per man. Bandoliers of extra ammunition slung across their chests. Entrenching tools. Water canteens, first aid kits. Some carried bazookas, portable anti-tank weapons that Italian soldiers had never seen before. Others carried satchel charges, Bangalore torpedoes, or additional mortar rounds. And somehow, impossibly, they moved with all this equipment. They weren't slowed down by their loads. They advanced steadily, fighting and moving, carrying enough supplies to sustain themselves for days without resupply. "How strong are these Americans?" Rousseau's sergeant asked, watching through binoculars as American soldiers climbed the hills carrying loads that would break Italian soldiers' backs. "They carry more than our mules." The answer wasn't strength, it was system. The American military had spent years developing equipment to distribute weight efficiently. Web gear and harnesses spread loads across shoulders and hips. Pack frames made heavy loads bearable. Everything was designed to let soldiers carry maximum equipment while maintaining mobility. But more than that, American logistics assumed soldiers would carry everything they needed for extended operations. Italian logistics assumed soldiers would be resupplied frequently by animal transport and supply wagons. Americans were self-sufficient for days. Italians needed resupply after hours. This became catastrophically clear when the Americans reached Rousseau's second defensive line. The Italians had retreated, taken positions, and prepared to hold. They'd expended about 30% of their ammunition in the beach defense and assumed they'd be resupplied before the next engagement. The Americans attacked again with the same overwhelming firepower, Garands cracking, bars hammering, mortars thumping. Russo's men returned fire, but their bolt-action rifles seemed pathetically inadequate against the American fire volume. After 10 minutes of intense fighting, several Italian soldiers reported they were running low on ammunition. Already? Russo couldn't believe it. They'd only fired 100 rounds or so per man. But Italian supply doctrine assumed a limited ammunition expenditure because bolt-action rifles couldn't fire rapidly anyway. They hadn't brought enough ammunition for a sustained firefight against an enemy who could fire 10 times faster. The Americans, meanwhile, showed no signs of ammunition shortage. They just kept firing, endless semi-automatic fire punctuated by bar bursts and mortar explosions. Each American soldier had started with 80 rounds immediately accessible plus more in their packs. The bar teams had 400 to 600 rounds. The mortar teams had dozens of shells. They could sustain this level of fire for hours. Russo realized with growing horror that he was losing a logistics battle disguised as a firefight. His men weren't being outfought, they were being outsupplied. The Americans could simply shoot more, longer, with greater effect, and there was nothing Italian tactical doctrine could do about it. "Conserve ammunition," Russo ordered. "Fire only aimed shots." But this created his own problem. When his men slowed their rate of fire to conserve ammunition, the Americans advanced. When they increased fire to halt the advance, they ran out of ammunition faster. There was no winning scenario. The Americans had them trapped in a math problem where every answer was wrong. After another 20 minutes, with half his men out of ammunition, and the rest nearly so, Russo ordered a retreat to the third defensive line, the last before the town of Gela itself. His company had been reduced by casualties and stragglers to maybe 70 effective soldiers. They'd faced what he estimated was a single American company, probably 150 to 200 men, and been systematically pushed back by superior firepower alone. At the third defensive line, Russo finally received resupply. Mules arrived with ammunition boxes and water. But the resupply was inadequate. The mule trains brought ammunition based on traditional consumption rates for bolt-action rifles. They hadn't accounted for fighting an enemy who could fire 10 times faster and required you to fire 10 times more just to keep up. As Russo's men distributed ammunition, scouts reported something disturbing. The Americans weren't stopping to resupply. They'd been fighting continuously for hours, had advanced several kilometers under fire, and showed no signs of logistics strain. How? The answer lay in American organization. Each American company had a weapons platoon that included not just mortars and machine guns, but also ammunition bearers, whose sole job was to keep the rifle platoon supplied. American units had jeeps and trucks that could drive right up to frontline positions to deliver ammunition and evacuate casualties. The entire American logistics system was designed for mobile warfare with high expenditure rates. Italian logistics was designed for World War I-style static warfare with low expenditure rates. Mule trains carried supplies to predetermined positions, manual distribution to units. It worked fine for bolt-action rifles firing a few rounds per minute. It collapsed completely against semi-automatic rifles firing 40 rounds per minute. That evening, as American forces consolidated their beachhead and pushed inland, Russo's company disintegrated. Some men surrendered, others retreated in disorder. Russo himself, with about 30 men, fell back to Gela and took up positions in the town, hoping urban terrain would negate American firepower advantages. It didn't. If anything, urban combat made the American advantages more pronounced. In the confined streets of Gela, American squads moved with a tactical sophistication that baffled the Italians. They used a technique called fire and movement. Half the squad would lay down suppressing fire while the other half advanced, then they'd switch. The suppressing fire was so intense, so continuous, that Italian defenders couldn't return effective fire. Private Giuseppe Marino, one of Russo's soldiers, described it in a letter written after his capture. They don't attack like soldiers, they attack like machines. Half of them shoot while half move forward, then they switch. The shooting never stops. We couldn't raise our heads without being shot at. We couldn't move without being shot at. We couldn't reload without being shot at. They pinned us down with just a few men, and then killed us at their leisure. Our rifles could fire maybe 10 times a minute. Their rifles fired 40, 50 times a minute. How do you fight that? The answer, increasingly, was that you didn't. Italian units across Sicily were discovering that they simply couldn't match American firepower. Traditional Italian tactics, firing positions, prepared defences, aimed rifle fire, became suicidal against an enemy who could overwhelm any position with sheer volume of fire. And then the Italians discovered another layer of American firepower that made the situation even more hopeless. The Americans could call in artillery and air support with terrifying speed. Russo, still fighting in Gela, noticed that whenever his remaining men concentrated in a position, American fire would suddenly intensify, not just from infantry weapons, but from artillery. Shells would start falling within minutes, not a preparatory barrage like Italian doctrine taught, but responsive fire that targeted wherever Italians appeared. The Americans had forward observers with radio equipment moving with the infantry. When they spotted a target, they could call for artillery fire and receive it within 5 to 10 minutes. Italian forward observation required runners or field telephones taking 30 to 60 minutes to coordinate fire support if it came at all. American artillery was also more abundant and more accurate. The Americans had standardized on the 105mm howitzer and brought dozens of them ashore within hours of landing. Italian artillery was a mixture of calibers and types, poorly supplied with ammunition, and often unable to reach the battlefield because fuel shortages immobilized the transport. The result was that American infantry never fought alone. They had artillery on call, air support on call, and enough organic firepower to handle most situations without calling for help. Italian infantry fought isolated without support using weapons that would have been adequate in 1918, but were obsolete in 1943. By the third day of the Sicily campaign, Capiano Russo was captured while trying to organize a counterattack with his remaining 15 men. He surrendered to an American lieutenant commanding a single platoon, about 40 men, who just finished clearing an entire neighborhood of Hela that Russo had thought would take a battalion to assault. In the POW cage, Russo encountered other Italian officers, all with similar stories of being overwhelmed by American firepower. A major from a different regiment described watching a single American company destroy his entire battalion in a 4-hour engagement. "They never stopped shooting," he said, still shocked. "We'd fire, take cover to reload, fire again. They just kept firing. Continuous fire from every position. We couldn't advance, couldn't flank them, couldn't even retreat without being shot down." A colonel, the senior Italian officer in the cage, organized a debriefing session where captured officers shared observations about American tactics and equipment. The picture that emerged was sobering. American infantry squads carried approximately 80 to 100 rounds per rifleman, Garand, with more in packs, 400 to 600 rounds per bar gunner, 10 to 20 rifle grenades, 4 to 8 hand grenades per man, 2 to 3 smoke grenades per man, 60mm mortar with 20 to 30 shells, bazookas with 4 to 6 rockets, Bangalore torpedoes for breaching obstacles, satchel charges for demolition, first aid supplies, 3 days of rations and water, total sustained firepower of a single American squad, comparable to an Italian company of 120 men, with the added advantages of mobility, flexibility, and immediate resupply capacity. "We were fighting the last war," the colonel said grimly. "We trained for World War I, where a bolt-action rifle and a few machine guns were adequate. The Americans are fighting the next war, where every soldier carries automatic weapons and every squad carries support weapons. We brought rifles to a machine gun fight." The Italian officers debated whether this was a fundamental advantage or just American material excess. Some argued that Italian soldiers, properly equipped with automatic weapons and modern support, could match Americans. Others argued that equipment was only part of it. American logistics, communication systems, and tactical doctrine all worked together to create overwhelming firepower superiority. They were both right. The Americans had better equipment, but more importantly, they had an integrated system designed to deliver maximum firepower to the point of contact. Every element, from weapon design to ammunition supply to tactical doctrine, was optimized for sustained, overwhelming fire. As more Italian units surrendered throughout the Sicily campaign, the pattern repeated. Italian officers consistently reported being outgunned by forces a fraction of their size. An Italian regiment would face an American battalion and lose. An Italian battalion would face an American company and barely hold. An Italian company would face an American platoon and retreat. The firepower disparity was so great that American forces often achieved success with ludicrously small numbers. There are documented cases of American squads, 12 men, clearing fortified positions held by Italian platoons of 40 men, not through superior tactics but simply through superior firepower. The Americans could put more rounds down range, faster, more accurately, and for longer periods than the Italians could match. Private Giuseppe Marino, captured at Gela, wrote about his experience in the POW camp journal. "I fired my Carcano rifle maybe 100 times during the battle. I thought I was fighting hard. Then I talked to American guards who'd been at Sicily. One told me he'd fired 300 rounds from his Garand in a single day. A single day. I'd fired 100 rounds in 3 days of fighting. They were shooting 3 times as much every day and never ran out of ammunition. How does anyone fight against that?" The psychological impact was profound. Italian soldiers began to fear American infantry in a way they didn't fear British or other Allied forces. British infantry used bolt-action Lee-Enfield rifles and were more evenly matched with Italian firepower. Americans, with their Garands and BARS, seemed almost superhuman in their capacity to project fire. When the Italian mainland was invaded in September 1943, Italian units that hadn't fought in Sicily were shocked by their first encounters with American firepower. They'd heard stories but dismissed them as exaggerations or excuses for poor performance. Then they experienced it themselves and understood. Maggiore Carlo Benedetti commanded a battalion defending Salerno. He'd dismissed reports from Sicily as cowardice disguised as tactical analysis. When he saw Americans coming ashore, he felt confident. His battalion outnumbered the landing American forces. His men had good positions. This time would be different. It wasn't. Within hours, Benedetti was frantically requesting reinforcements, not because his men were cowards, but because they were being systematically pinned down and destroyed by American fire. Every position his men took, American fire found them. Every counterattack was met with walls of automatic fire that shredded Italian formations. After 2 days, Benedetti's battalion had ceased to exist as a combat-effective unit, not because of a single dramatic defeat, but because American firepower had slowly, methodically ground them down. They'd been shot to pieces by forces half their size. In his final report before being relieved of command, Benedetti wrote, "We cannot win firefights against American infantry. Their weapon systems and ammunition supply give them insurmountable advantage at squad and platoon level. Traditional Italian infantry tactics assume rough parity in firepower. Against Americans, we need 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 numerical superiority just to achieve parity in actual firepower delivered to target. Recommend immediate modernization of infantry weapons or withdrawal from any engagement with American forces." His recommendation was ignored because Italy lacked the industrial capacity to modernize. Italian factories were already struggling to produce enough bolt-action rifles and obsolete machine guns. Producing semi-automatic rifles, automatic rifles, and modern support weapons at the scale needed was simply impossible. The Italian army was trapped with inadequate weapons, facing an enemy with superior weapons, and no way to close the gap. The result was predictable. Italian units, when forced to fight, were systematically destroyed. When given the option, they increasingly chose surrender over fighting a battle they knew they couldn't win. By the time Italy surrendered in September 1943, Italian soldiers had learned a bitter lesson. Industrial capacity matters more than courage. Training and tactics matter less than equipment. A brave soldier with a bolt-action rifle will lose to an average soldier with a semi-automatic rifle every time, simply because the semi-automatic can fire faster. Did you know that after World War II, armies worldwide abandoned bolt-action rifles for semi-automatic or automatic weapons? That the infantry squad as Americans designed it, organized around automatic weapons with every rifleman capable of high-volume fire, became the global standard? That the lessons Italian soldiers learned in Sicily about firepower dominance shaped military thinking for the next 70 years? Capitano Russo, the officer captured at Gela, survived the war and returned to Italy. In the 1960s, when the Italian army finally modernized with semi-automatic rifles and modern machine guns, he attended a demonstration of the new equipment. Watching Italian soldiers fire modern weapons, he commented to a reporter, "This is what we should have had in 1943. Every man capable of automatic fire, enough ammunition to sustain it, support weapons integrated into every unit. The Americans had this 20 years ago. We wondered why we lost. Now I know. We brought 19th-century weapons to a 20th-century war and wondered why the enemy's bullets arrived faster than ours." The Italian troops who never knew American soldiers carried more firepower than entire units learned through experience what industrial war meant. Not glorious charges and tactical brilliance, but mathematical superiority in the amount of lead you could deliver to the enemy per minute. They trained to be soldiers in an army of soldiers. They encountered walking arsenals backed by an industrial system that could supply those arsenals indefinitely. And all the courage and training in the world couldn't overcome the simple fact that their enemies could shoot faster, more accurately, for longer, with more support, while carrying enough supplies to do it again tomorrow. Sometimes wars aren't won by better soldiers. They're won by better tools. And in 1943, American infantry had tools that made them individually more lethal than entire Italian squads, collectively more devastating than Italian companies, and systematically more effective than Italian battalions. That wasn't propaganda, that was mathematics, delivered at 2,800 feet per second from a Garand rifle that could fire 8 rounds before an Italian soldier finished firing 2.